There was a time when wearing helmets wasn't even a thing in the motorsport world. Yep, back in the day, drivers used to zip around with nothing but some caps and goggles. F1 has come a long way since then, and it's worth taking a look back. This is the complete evolution of Formula One helmets. So, believe it or not, helmets weren't always the norm in the world of high-speed racing, especially when you go all the way back to the 1890s. In those days, things were painfully slow. So slow that even horses were faster than cars. And so, drivers didn't really care for helmets. Instead, they opted for backward-facing caps and goggles. Looking back now, it seems wild that more people didn't wear protective gear, especially since racing cars were a lot more dangerous back then. Racetracks were lined with trees instead of guardrails, with no separation between the cars and the spectators, no seatbelts, and cars with huge, crushable fuel tanks. That sounds pretty risky, right? But when motorsport was starting to rev up in the early 1900s, life was generally more dangerous. Many of these sports' early pioneers were World War veterans, so anything that didn't involve being shot at probably seemed like a step up. But then, in 1914, things started to change, thanks to Dr. Eric Gardner. He's the guy who introduced the concept of helmets in the motorsport world, which ended up carrying over to the four-wheeled one too. So just how did he do it? Well, Dr. Gardner, who was a medic at the Isle of Man, TT, noticed the high number of concussions from races. So he convinced the rule makers to require all riders to wear a newly developed helmet. This helmet was a pudding bowl shape that simply sat on top of the rider's head. And here's the fun little bit. It was made from layers of canvas, which were all bonded together by shellac. Now, what's that, you ask? Well, it's a resin produced by the female lac bug found on trees in India. It might not sound tough, but this is basically an early form of fiberglass, which is a key material in modern helmet construction. That's right, Mr. Gardner had stumbled onto one of the earliest versions of modern helmet tech. While these helmets weren't perfect and big impacts could still cause damage, they were definitely better than nothing. After these were introduced, race medics noted that the number of riders who suffered concussions went down dramatically. And so by the 1920s and 30s, they became a common sight on racetracks. But it wasn't until 1952 that all F1 drivers were required to wear helmets. At the time, one of the first companies to make helmets specifically for the motorsport world was the British company Oak. Their early models were based on helmets worn by polo players, and let's just say drivers took a liking to it. You had tons of people adopting it, from Mike Hawthorne to Sterling Moss. It was like the coolest thing on the market for these people. And it wasn't all just hype. The helmet offered more protection on the side of the head, and improved impact absorption too, with the addition of a cork lining. But, of course, it's hard not to get mixed in with a sea of other drivers when you're all wearing the same helmet. So even back then, drivers were personalizing their helmets for better identification. Graham Hill's simple but effective dark blue helmet with white stripes, for example, was a tribute to the London Rowing Club. This is an art form that's still carried on today, with artists nowadays making some truly stunning designs. Now, the next big leap in helmet technology came in the late 1950s. This is when Roy Richter started the Bell Helmet Company, drawing inspiration from the helmets worn by fighter pilots. By 1957, he had developed the Bell 500 TX. This new model was the first motor racing helmet to pass the Snell standard, a certification named after William Pete Snell. Sadly, he wasn't around to see it get made, because earlier he'd been killed in an accident that many thought was survivable if only he had a stronger and better helmet. His death wasn't in vain though, because it was after he passed that some of his doctor friends decided to put their feet down and really push for more progress to be made in the helmet safety department. And so, the Bell 500 TX was formed. It had a hard fiberglass shell and a non-resilient plastic foam liner. What does that mean? Well, basically during an impact, the liner would compress and absorb some of the energy, slowing down the driver's head and reducing the impact. This is more or less the same theory we use in helmets nowadays too. It's kinda cool to think people back then had already cracked the code, huh? But helmet evolution was only just getting started, because the late 60s brought some pretty big changes. So until 1968, all helmets were open-faced models, leaving the driver's face fully exposed. Bell, once again, being ahead of the curve, brought forward the idea of a helmet with actual face protection. This was called the Star, and was made with the help of American F1 driver Dan Gurney. Gurney, being taller than most drivers, was tired of getting hit in the face by stones, so naturally he came up with a solution. But here's the catch. There were some safety concerns regarding these new helmets. For one, people thought they'd steam up in the wet or not provide enough airflow when it was hot. But as the safety improvements became clearer, more drivers started to adopt them. And so, the 70s saw new brands like Jebs and the Italian helmet manufacturer AGV. And yeah, that's the same AGV that supplied Niki Lauda with a lighter helmet in the 1976 season, when he was with Ferrari. Moving on to 1979, all helmets in F1 had to be fitted with a medical air supply. This was after a series of fiery accidents where drivers suffocated or died from smoke inhalation. That's honestly a rough way to go, and to avoid such a fate, some drivers also wore a large Nomex scarf attached to the base of the helmet for extra fire protection. By the time the 80s rolled in, Bell was still one of the lead helmet designers in F1. Its unique Star model was still alive and kicking, with quite a few interesting versions of it. But it wasn't the only company in the helmet game anymore. One of the most innovative helmets was from the French company GPA, which had a unique fastening system. Instead of the conventional strap, the GPA had a twin horseshoe system that clipped together on either side of the chin. Now, while this helmet was definitely comfortable, as far as safety was concerned, some people were not happy with it. Especially after Gilles Villeneuve's fatal crash at Zolder when his helmet came off. It was clear that work still needed to be done. So, FIA regulations brought some stability to the design and features of the helmets, and they started to look fairly similar. It wasn't about being comfortable anymore. After all, what's the point of feeling comfy if these things pop off your head the second things get a bit dangerous? So in the 90s, a complex mix of materials, including fiberglass and Kevlar, was developed to make helmets lighter while still retaining strength. And with the turn of the century, the FIA was once again in the mood for some change. So they introduced a new helmet regulation. All helmets had to now weigh around 1.25 kilograms, thanks to being made almost entirely of carbon fiber. Weight differences were a thing of the past. But that's not all. Another huge change came in 2003 with the introduction of the hands device. This carbon fiber collar, worn over the shoulders, is designed to prevent the neck from hyperextending during a big hit. But the biggest change is due to modern tech, which has completely revolutionized the helmet game. Nowadays, helmets like Schubert can be fully custom-made by laser scanning the driver's head and building the liner to perfectly fit. It might sound like something out of a science fiction movie, but it's all too real. But these don't come cheap. Making a specialized helmet like this can cost you around $4,000 to $5,000. That might seem like a lot for a single piece of equipment, but keep in mind helmets are often the thing standing between these drivers and certain death. So there's no point in being cheap when it comes to helmets. And price aside, modern helmets are also a lot safer. Especially with the introduction of the Halo device, more and more is being done to try to protect the only exposed part of the driver that people can still see. Anyway, if you want to check out some more content on F1 racing and its history, make sure to click on this next video.